how we treat offenders often also shows what image of humanity we have.
Something that just makes so much sense to me is the whole philosophy surrounding the prisons here in Germany.
If Antoinette says so, let's see how Germany does it.
Welcome to YD. Why do Germans do things the way they do?
Punishment has been known since antiquity and also in the anthropology of primitive peoples. There were typically three forms of punishment. On the one hand, there is something like substitute punishment or fines. Anyone who broke something had to pay compensation. Then there were honor punishments or even banishment from the community. The latter could sometimes be equivalent to death sentences. This was also the third type of punishment, corporal punishment or even death sentences. For a long time, prisoners were only imprisoned if it was worthwhile, for example, in the case of captured noblemen such as Richard the Lionheart. For normal criminals, a prison sentence made no sense. The prince lacked laborers in the workshop or on the field and even had to feed them. On the other hand, the death penalty was sometimes imposed very quickly, even for offenses that are comparatively minor today, such as theft. While debt bondage was already mentioned in the Codex Hammurabi around 1800 BC, debts prisons emerged in the late Middle Ages. The inmates had debts, had to work them off during the day and go back to prison in the evening. This was actually similar to today's open prison system, except that the inmates had often committed no crime at all. In medieval Europe, the penal system was also characterized by Christianity. A death sentence could only be justified if the criminal had violated the divine order. In the end, it was equally important that the repentant sinner return to the bosom of the church, repentant of his offense before death, and beg God for forgiveness. This was then also honored by the people present. While beggars, for example, were sometimes driven out of the city from 1596, there was a new institution, the Zuchthaus, penitentiary, originally set up in Amsterdam as a prison with compulsory labor. This principle even led to a softening of the penalties. Whereas thieves, for example, had previously been executed, they could now be sent to a prison that operates like a penitentiary. Prisoners now had to work for their stay. Penitentiary often became profit-oriented businesses, and there was great interest in filling them to capacity. As the penal system progressed, the penitentiary became the harsher form of prison. Labor was sometimes very hard in quarries or mines. A non-dishonorable form of imprisonment, on the other hand, was fortress imprisonment, which was imposed on duelists, for example, which was officially forbidden but tolerated. The colonial powers also established penal colonies in their most remote colonies. During the Enlightenment, people began to oppose capital punishment. Tsarin Elizabeth I spoke out against the death penalty in 1741. As crime did not increase, her successors also had the death penalty suspended. In Germany, the death penalty existed until the founding of the Federal Republic of Germany. The basic law prohibits the death penalty, which was still partially enshrined in state constitutions. The death penalty was only abolished from the Hessian state constitution in 2018. On 31st of March 2024, there were around 43,700 prisoners in Germany, 1% fewer than a year earlier. Most were serving short prison sentences up to 2 years. Sentences have four aspects. Firstly, it is intended to bring about a change in behavior for the better. Secondly, it should serve as a deterrent. Thirdly, they are intended to prevent such an offense from being committed again. And fourthly, it should be a punishment for an offense, like a kind of atonement and restoration of justice. The entire punishment should be aimed at changing the behavior of the convicted person. As far as possible, suspended sentences or fines are imposed in Germany, especially for first time offenders or minor offenses. A distinction is also made between juvenile criminal law and adult criminal law. In the case of juveniles, the idea of education is emphasized. What is punishment? In simple terms, the punishment is the fact that you are locked up and cannot freely determine your day and whereabouts. There is no need to unnecessarily complicate the circumstances of your stay. A few rights are restricted, but the right to vote is hardly ever restricted. If you look at the point change in behavior, you can check this very well with the recidivism rate. In Germany, the recidivism rate is around 34% 3 years after release. In the USA, the relapse rate is around 68%, which is twice as high. But it can also be better. In Norway, the recidivism rate is around 20% within 2 years and only 39% after 5 years. Norway is regarded as a leader in the resocialization of offenders.
Rapists, all doing time in a maximum security prison that feels more like a college campus. This is home?
Yeah, this is home, yeah.
Karsten was convicted of killing a man in Brazil. This is his cell block with a full kitchen, big screen TV, laundry room. The point here to turn criminals into good neighbors.
Always have coffee on the go.
Rehabilitation, says the prison governor, starts on day one.
We take the freedom from them, but when they are here, we try to help them to get a better citizens.
Resocialization is beneficial for everyone. As in the Middle Ages, spending time in prison costs money and the prisoner is lost as a laborer and taxpayer. It therefore makes sense to achieve a change to a law-abiding citizen. Resocialization also means being able to live alone or in a new household after leaving prison. Anyone who has had a very strict daily routine in prison for perhaps years, without being able to decide on their own leisure time, cook their own meals or do their own laundry, or even give themselves a treat with a little shopping, or even cope with boredom without taking drugs, can't do that so easily on the outside either.
So we went to Germany to understand how you can do things differently. They've taken the structures, the architecture around prisons, and they've modified them and changed the people inside them. They run their prisons based in human dignity and organized around the principle of normalization, that prisons should replicate the outside community as much as possible.
In Germany, some prisons offer occupational therapy or art therapy. There are prison newspapers such as Berlin's Lichtblicke, or sometimes animals are used and cared for by the prisoners, or cats that are difficult to place are reintroduced to people so that they can be rehomed. In Bavaria, healthy budgerigars are allowed to be taken into prison. All of this offers the prisoners a purpose, a task, and a prospect for themselves and their future life in freedom or for the animal. Of course, it is important to have the opportunity to carry out such measures. This would not be possible in overcrowded prisons with too few staff. However, German prisons are only about 80% full. The number of young people in prison has been drastically reduced since 2000.
5 years ago, this juvenile prison in Herford, North Rhine-Westphalia was full. But since 2013, it has housed fewer and fewer prisoners. The director has actually closed down part of the complex.
We closed sections B2 and B3. Those are the two upper floors of this building. We closed them because we have a lot fewer prisoners.
There are also countries in which the occupancy rate is even lower than in Germany, but in over 60% of countries, according to the 2024 study by UNODOC, prisons are overcrowded in some cases to such an extent that the sheer mass alone makes it life-threatening. In order to enable resocialization, the reasons for criminal offenses must also be addressed. Germany has a very low youth unemployment, which is also due to the dual vocational training system. In some federal states, great efforts are made to ensure that all school leavers have a connection to a further school or a training company. If someone has to go to prison, they have the opportunity to complete a school leaving certificate or vocational training there. Apart from this, it is also possible to work. Well, according to the law, you have to work. Prisoners also receive a small wage. The previous remuneration, which often ranged from €1.20 to a good €2.50 per hour, was deemed too low by the Federal Constitutional Court. In Saxony and almost all federal states, the basic remuneration will be increased from 9% to 15% of the average salary of all employees with statutory pension insurance in Germany from mid-2025. However, prisoners who are obliged to work in Germany are still not covered by pension insurance for this period. After a long prison sentence, this can lead to a problem in old age with a lack of contribution years and the risk of falling into poverty in old age and reoffending as a result. The opportunity to earn some money in prison makes it possible to buy things for personal use, but also to build up reserves for time after release. The Gefangenengewerkschaft, Prisoners Union, would like to have the minimum wage, currently €12.81, which would also make it possible to pay compensation to the victims. The German federal states are counting the high cost for prisoners against this. The Ministry of Justice in Bavaria puts the daily cost for a prisoner at €157.76 per day. The costs naturally include accommodation, food and clothing, but there are also numerous social workers and trainers. Some of the products from the workshops are bought by industry or sold in the prison's own shops. Depending on the progress of the sentence and the offense, prisoners may also be in an open prison. This means that they leave the prison in the morning to go to school or work outside during the day and return in the evening to spend the evening and night in their cell. At the end of their sentence, inmates are also granted holidays or time off so that they can look for a new flat, register with a job center, or possibly attend a job interview. Of course, this is only possible if the prisons are easily accessible. Prisons are often historically located in the center of the city, or even new buildings are constructed on the outskirts. This makes it easy for friends and families or legal counselors to visit the inmates. This also paves the way for release, normality, and resocialization. However, there are also people who have been found to have committed a besondere Schwere der Schuld, particularly serious offense. This can be the case, for example, if a person has already committed several crimes, and it must be assumed that this person is a danger to the general public even after serving their prison sentence, and that there is a high risk of reoffending. In such cases, the person is subsequently placed in Sicherungsverwahrung, Preventive Detention, currently 604 people throughout Germany. It is difficult for outsiders to tell the difference, as these people are often housed in special buildings on the ground of a prison. They often have a small flat and can furnish it themselves. They actually have a lot of freedom, but still have to remain locked up. They are no longer punished, but are not allowed to move around freely. In the public perception, some people sometimes feel that sentences are too light or that prisoners are far too well off. However, deterrence through draconian punishment cannot be proven with certainty. Most studies show no evidence of deterrence throughout punishments. As the example of Tsarin Elizabeth I of Russia showed, the absence of the death penalty was not a reason to commit more crimes. In general, swift punishment is more important than harsh punishment. In Germany, the threat of punishment in law is intended as a deterrent, the sentencing and the judgment is intended as retribution, and the execution of the sentence in prison is intended to resocialize. Other countries place even more emphasis on resocialization. Some countries, for example, electronic ankle bracelets are used for location monitoring during house arrest. In Germany, this electronic monitoring has so far been used for monitoring sex offenders. It might be even better or more cost-effective if people with minor convictions could be restricted in their own home. and environment while continuing to work and participate in social life, albeit to a limited extent. They would still have their social environment and would not necessarily be resocialized. As in many areas, Germany has a good mix here too. It is not in the top group, but is already very far ahead. We remain decent. Addition, remarks and comments in the comments. Thank you for your attention. See you in the next video.